So who do you reckon the founding fathers of Australia are? Well, there's Captain Cook, of course. There's Arthur Phillip, who decided where Sydney should be. John Batman, who laid out Melbourne. But let's give it up today for two founding mothers, Mrs. Farrell and Mrs. Kennedy.
Jesus.
Who, you may ask? Well, without them, none of this, what became the richest city in the whole world, would have existed. Where is it? It's Bendigo, of course. But first, I've got to get down from here. See you in a bit. Piece of country Australia, Bendigo. Plenty of gold here, and not just below the ground. I'm off to the theatre to play writer Mark Twain. It's my show, so I get the biggest part. The strange case of the underage spy and the mini miner. So you went home and told your parents?
I was young and naive, yes.
And guerrilla warfare that saved a humble tram. This is Che Guevara. So it's 1851, and while their husbands are off working, Mrs. Farrell and Mrs. Kennedy are out walking. That walk put Bendigo on the map, because they found so many gold nuggets lying by the tiny river, they filled their stockings with them. One way or another, I reckon their hubbies were in for a nice surprise when they got home. It's true, I feel like I've done half the walk already. Whoops. What's odd about this place is that it shouldn't really be here. Let me explain. Bendigo was an absolutely barking mad place to build a city. At the time when Mrs. Farrell and Mrs. Kennedy were staggering around with all those nuggets in their knickers, this was the only source of water in the whole place. Now, it's been raining recently. You can see all that grass in the cracks. Nevertheless, there's virtually no water there at all. But loads and loads of people, thousands, were attracted here because of the possibility of finding nuggets or alluvial gold that they could pan. But eventually that ran out, and that was when phase 2 of the Bendigo goldfield started, as epitomised by this mine here. It's hard to over-exaggerate the amount of gold there was to be found underneath Bendigo. This is a walking graph, right? If most of the goldfields had about that much gold, and Ballarat, which was a big one, had, say, that much gold, then Bendigo had about this much gold. And in order to get it, the amount of engineering that was deployed was colossal. See, they would drill down up to a mile deep. About 5,000 shafts underneath Bendigo, and because there were so many seams of gold, around about 37 of them, they would drill out in every direction, always chasing the gold until the whole place was honeycombed by tunnels. Even today, Bendigo is like an enormous Malteser, except that it's not round and it's not covered with chocolate, obviously. It's a metaphor, but hang on, what's that? Hey, look at that, look at that. Yeah, there's a cable. There's a cable going up there, going round into this shed. Hello? Hello? Can you come a minute? Can I ask you about this stuff?
Yeah, certainly.
Is your name Carl, or is that just the name of the boiler suit?
No, my name is actually Carl, yes.
Carl, this machinery is really impressive. Was that brought in from England, from the north of England?
No, it wasn't actually. This machine was actually built here in Bendigo in 1896 by a local foundry. And we actually exported machinery to England and also to places like South Africa and America.
That's typical little imperialist me, isn't it? I assumed that you were sent this by us Brits.
Oh, yes, and that's generally what most people think. They think it's made in England or America or somewhere like that, and they're quite shocked when we actually say, no, it was actually made here in Bendigo.
Can you show me a bit more of how the whole place works?
Yes, certainly, shall we?
In today's money, Bendigo produced $28 billion worth of gold. But as the water table rose and the market price dropped, mines were closed and then demolished. Deborah was preserved as a link to the city's past. These things I really love because they give you an incredibly vivid impression of what life would have been like in Bendigo at the height of the gold rush. They're called stampers, and their job is to smash up the quartz or the ore in order to get the gold out. Carl, can you turn them on so we can demonstrate what they're like? See what I mean? These things operated for 24 hours a day. But what's really bizarre is that when they were turned off on a Saturday evening, nobody could sleep because they were so used to all that terrible noise. Thank you, Carl. See ya. It's funny, when you're confronted by all that extraordinary mining equipment, it's a bit like seeing the skeleton of an elephant in the sand, isn't it? All that power, and it's gone so long ago. But there are lots of other very powerful stories in Bendigo, and to be frank, a lot of them are even more fascinating. Come on. I can't do this without you, can I? My walk's taking me to a house on Carland Street, a few blocks over from the mine. I know I've only just started, but all this walking's making me thirsty. Hi, Laurie.
G'day, Tony.
Good to see you, mate.
Good to see you.
Could I have a look down in your cellar?
Certainly, come in.
Laurie is the owner of this place, but it's not him I've come to see. I'm interested in what's at the bottom of these stairs. It looks like a bomb shelter, although it was more likely a good place to get bombed. It's a 19th century wine cellar, and I'm meeting a bloke to find out about a cheeky little 19th century Bendigo drop that got right up the Europeans' noses. Stuart.
Ah.
Thank you for inviting me to your tasting.
Pleasure.
These Bendigo wines in the late 19th century, they were incredibly well received internationally, weren't they?
Indeed, yes. Particularly, I think it was the very first completely international exhibition, which was in Vienna in 1873. The judging panel, composed mainly of Frenchmen, were totally blown away by these wines and would not believe that they were colonial wines.
They were quality wines.
Oh, indeed.
In
yes.
which case, why was it that the Bendigo industry died out?
The major thing that destroyed the wine industry in Bendigo was the infestation of phylloxera. It's a minute aphid-type insect that sucks on the roots and it just eventually kills. They go into decline and the vines die.
But that's not the end of the story, is it? Because you've been instrumental in bringing the industry here back to life again.
For my sins, yes.
Which is why I've lured you here, in order to try and taste a bit of your wine.
Why not? Why not?
Is this the one that we're tasting?
I thought I'd show you that one. This is an 1880 wine from Bendigo, and this comes from this cellar. Wow. It came from this cellar.
So you reckon that that wine might taste all right?
Yes, but I'm not going to show you. But you can taste one from 100 years later.
Thank you very much.
This one from 1980, and we can drink this one.
Oh, this is gorgeous, isn't it? Well, to a flourishing Bendigo wine industry once again.
Thank you. Cheers.
Thank you very much. See you again. Cheers, Laurie. It's a nice spot of wine for you down there.
Cheers, mate.
See you. And now back towards town. The Sacred Heart Cathedral in Short Street looks really weird to me. And not just because it's so flaming big. All right, it's Gothic, but it's all hard edges like something out of a cartoon. I suppose that's because, unlike European cathedrals, it's only 150 years old and hasn't had the chance to become softened, weathered and rounded. Maybe if I come back in another 150 years. Just round the corner here, there's a piece of architecture that's almost the exact polar opposite. This wall certainly has been softened and weathered and rounded. It's the last remaining wall in Bendigo built in the old Chinese style. Because in the 1860s, there were as many Chinese on the Bendigo goldfield as there were Europeans. But then when the surface gold ran out and they were excluded from the mines, then they had to move away or get other jobs like making and laying bricks. You can see that these bricks are... Hang on, this one comes away. Look, they're much smaller, aren't they, than the standard Aussie brick. Although I better put this one back before anyone sees, because this wall is actually heritage listed, which is a good thing. Although, let's be honest, it is quite a ropey old wall, isn't it? It's hardly the Great Wall of China. If I'd been alive in the 19th century, I don't think I'd have had the guts to cross the globe in search of gold. But I could see myself getting up on stage to entertain the locals, which is exactly what American writer and humorist Mark Twain did back in 1895. Don, we all know who Mark Twain was because of Huckleberry Finn and Tom Sawyer, but whatever was he doing in Bendigo?
He was on a world tour to pay back a debt, a big debt, $100,000.
How did he lose all that money?
He lost it by investing unwisely in a typesetting machine, which he thought would make him fabulously rich. But he lost a lot.
So he was schlepping all around the world just to pay back his debt?
Yeah, Australia, New Zealand, India, Ceylon.
And something very odd happened in Bendigo, didn't it?
Yes, well, he met a man who he calls Mr. Blank.
OK, stop right there, because this is a theatre, so we're not going to tell you what happened next. We're going to perform it for you. Don, get your acting shoes on.
I should have told you about the lack of my acting shoes.
Right, I'm going to play Mark Twain because it's my show, so I get the best part. And on the night in question, Twain is addressing the audience. He finishes, there's rapturous applause, and then, Don, this is your big moment, onto the stage comes another man who was...
Mr. Blank.
Exactly, at least that's what Mark Twain called him. But then he admits a bit more about himself, which is...
That he is the president of the Mark Twain Society of Corrigan Castle, Ireland.
Whereupon Twain's stomach sinks. He knows about this society. Why does he know about them?
Because they've been sending him their proceedings and their speeches and everything that happened to them for many years.
Which was very flattering, first of all.
Very flattering, but then he found the task altogether too onerous and burnt the lot.
Because they were sending so much stuff.
Yes, he burnt them as they arrived.
But in the meantime, the characters of all the members of this society had burnt themselves onto his mind. He wrote about them in his book, Following the Equator. We will demonstrate those characters tonight with the help of the Bendigo Historical Society. Ladies and gentlemen, Jim, Chris, Robbie, Terry and Darren. Now, Jim is playing Naylor, who, according to Mark Twain, had a polished style, a happy knack of felicitous metaphor. I think he's doing that very well, isn't he? Chris is Forbes, who was courtly and elegant and deployed scalding satire. Palmer used virile, eloquent abuse. Norris was wholly without ornament, compact and lucid. It's the beard that does it, isn't it? And Calder never spoke when he was sober and spoke all the time when he wasn't. And finally, of course, there was...
Mr. Blank.
And his job was...
To take the minutes.
Exactly. So, during the course of the evening, they continued their conversation until Mark Twain admitted that he'd burned all the papers and stuff, whereupon Mr. Blank made an admission too, didn't he?
Yes, that he was the author of the whole thing.
Exactly! There was no Mr. Naylor, Mr. Forbes, no Palmer, nor any of them. They were all a figment of Mr. Blank's imagination. Imagine what a humiliation that must have been to Mark Twain. At the beginning of the evening, he was the most famous man in the world, with a massive fan base in Ireland. But by the end of the evening, that fan club had been reduced to one nutter.
Mr. Blank.
Or Mark Twain, let's face it, they were all figments of his imagination, weren't they?
Very likely.
If Mark Twain could dream up Huck Finn and Tom Sawyer, then he could definitely make up a load of old twaddle like Mr. Blank and his imaginary fan club. Well, thanks, Tom. See you guys. Thanks a lot. This is Bendigo, a city full of gold. We found it underground, by the bottle, and up on stage. Now I'm heading into the centre of town. It's time for me to go deep undercover. Imagine the scene. It's the summer of 1962 here on Bendigo High Street, and there's a man pacing up and down and up and down, and in the curb there is a Mini right here. Up and down he paces, up and down, and eventually he puts his hand on the door, opens it, gets in, and begins talking to this man. Philip, who was the mysterious bloke and what did he want?
He called himself Mr. Mac, and he said he was an ASIO agent.
Which means what?
The Australian Security Intelligence Organisation.
And were you aware of that organisation?
Never heard of it.
Forget the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Cold War had come to Bendigo, and ASIO was recruiting new agents. The younger, the better, apparently.
I was 19.
So you're a bit young, really, weren't you?
Young and naive, yes.
So you went home and told your parents?
Yes. Mr. Mac said, well, here's some papers. You're too young to sign them yourself.
The Official Secrets Act?
Of course. I had to take them home to my mum and dad for them to sign, which they said, you know, are you sure you know what you're doing, Phil, you know? And I, to be honest, I said, well, I'm not...
Absolutely no idea. So no more hanging around in cars anymore. You had to start going to meetings.
That's right.
Who were the people you were spying on?
Communists, Tony.
What were they like?
They were just ordinary, everyday people, working class people, between late 50s to early 60s.
So getting on?
Getting on, and yeah.
It was more than 10 years since the communists had had any real political clout, and Philip's targets were its senior citizens. Anyway, on to Bendigo's historic Hotel Shamrock, a traditional stop for royalty, VIPs, weary travellers, and soon-to-be ex-spies. In 1986, Philip's ASIO minder summoned him to a lunch on the balcony. So you'd had the meal and a bit of small talk. Yeah. Then what did he say?
That you're no longer required in the organisation. Thank you for your service, but please don't ever contact us again.
So you were completely cut adrift?
I was absolutely cut adrift and gutted.
Do you feel that that 23 years was wasted?
To be honest, I do. In the beginning, I thought I was doing the patriotic job that I thought I was doing. Looking back on it, there was just a sheer, complete waste of time and money that the organisation spent, you know.
What I find so extraordinary is that all this should have happened in a little town like Bendigo.
Exactly right.
Well, thank you for sharing that extraordinary story with me. I hope this meal has been slightly more cheery than the one all those years ago.
Tony.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Philip's such a gentle and sweet guy. I didn't have the heart to tell him that in the 1960s I used to hang around with Marxists and communists and I was demonstrating against the Vietnam War. In fact, if I'd been living in Bendigo at the time, it would have been me that Philip would have been spying on. There's another little story about the Shamrock Hotel that really tickles my fancy. This is the room in which I'm staying while I'm in Bendigo. This is my bed, this is my desk. Here's another little bed in case I have a friend to stay. But that's not the story. The story is that this room is known as the Dame Nellie Melba Suite because this woman, the internationally renowned opera singer and diva Nellie Melba, came to Bendigo in the early years of the 20th century to perform and slept in this very room. And she was woken up in the middle of the night by this noise. It was, of course, the clock on top of the post office, and she was incensed that she'd been disturbed by such a cacophony and ordered that it should be switched off. And it was. I mean, you can imagine that must have been something of an affront to the people of Bendigo, who'd laid out a lot of money for that clock. But on the other hand, she was a musician, and it is a pretty terrible chime, isn't it? Anyway, once it was switched off, she was able to have a good night's sleep, woke up the next day thoroughly refreshed, went down to the Royal Princess Theatre and sang her heart out.
Tell you what, the old girl could really punch out a tune.
I know this is supposed to be a walk, but I'm going to cheat. I'm going in this. Let's go!
I've jumped aboard this tram because, just like my old Marxist mates, I love a good cause. Especially one that goes back to the heady days of the 70s.
Did you guys know that there was a time when the council wanted to get rid of all the trams? Do you think that would have been a good idea? No! I think we're starting a revolution here. Well, the story of how these trams were saved is right down there at the depot. This is the depot, and it was here that the acts of civil disobedience that I told you about at the top of the walk took place. Dennis, why did the council want to stop the trams?
No, the Bendigo City Council wanted to keep them. It was the State Electricity Commission of Victoria that wanted to get rid of the trams.
I pointed the finger at the wrong people. I'm sorry, councillors. It was the Lecky who wanted to do it,
Yeah,
right?
What happened in 1972, the SEC finished the trams and they wanted to get rid of every one of them, but we weren't going to let that happen.
So what did you do?
I was a school teacher. I was teaching a class and one of the volunteers came and said, look, they've got a truck and they've lifted up the tram to go to Adelaide. And I said, no way.
So, all right, no way, but what did you do?
Oh, I rang up a group of friends, all the tram enthusiasts, and we came down dead night, pushed the tram back in the depot.
Hang on a minute. You pushed a tram like this from here through to there?
Exactly.
You must have been mad. Hold on. Excuse me, I'm sorry to bother you again, but Dennis and his mates pushed a tram just like this into there. Can we see if we can do that? Let's give it a go. Come on, yeah. All right. OK, go on, Dennis.
1, 2, 3.
That's fairly used. Again. 1, 2, 3. Not an inch. So that was supposed to be a historical reenactment. It was absolute failure.
But Tony, you've got to realise, we're 40 years younger and the adrenaline was pumping in us, so we could do almost anything.
Sure. You managed to get the tram from here through to there. Then what?
We pushed the tram in the depot, welded pipes across the track so it couldn't move. I took the carbon brushes out to immobilise it. Then the doors were welded.
These big doors here?
Exactly.
So when the blokes from Adelaide came here the next morning to collect their tram, what happened?
Well, the whole depot was full of people and trucks and cars, and I'm very sorry the transport had to go back to Adelaide empty-handed.
So you orchestrated a complete mass civil disobedience?
We certainly did.
This is all your fault. This is Che Guevara.
No, Che Guevara's dead. I'm still here living in Bendigo.
I'm glad to know that. Well done, mate. Good on you. Excellent. Thanks, guys. Thanks for everything. Even though it was completely fruitless.
We may not have moved the tram, but we have crisscrossed about 6 kilometres of this lovely country town in about half a day. And I'm finishing up in Rosalind Park, right in the heart of Bendigo.
It's a beautifully kept city with lovely green open spaces, a thriving art scene, and loads of stories about wine and opera singers and great writers, and even the occasional spy. So if you do come here, be careful, because you never quite know who's watching you. Captain Cook, right? Everybody goes on about what a great sailor he was and what a brilliant navigator, but he kept missing really important things. Like, he totally failed to spot Sydney Harbour, which you've got to admit is a pretty big omission. And then when he came further up the east coast to here, he saw this big lump of rock, which is now called Nobby's. I think you can probably see why, but he failed to spot the fact that just beyond it is one of the most functional harbours in the world, Newcastle. Duh.
It seems I've been everywhere in Australia, but not Newcastle. So let's see what we can uncover. How about an Aussie digger who went to war in his pyjamas?
Who says the British Empire's dead?
Maybe you'd prefer a lesson in convict slang.
Guns.
Guns, yes. Oh, it's a bit scary that you know the answer to that.
Or there's the night the music stopped and the crowd started.
Seconds later.
So a city that went from a sail-by on a Cook's tour to the biggest coal exporter in the world has plenty to offer. And it starts with the incredible shrinking Nobby's Head, that big hill behind me.
In the early days of the colony, this harbour was really scary because Nobby's was just an island back then. So the tide used to come whipping in across here, go smack into the harbour. In fact, it was so terrifying that people said that when sailors came into port, their faces were ashen with terror. So in 1818, Governor Macquarie decided to build a breakwater in order to stop the tide, using the raw material off Nobby's as the basis for it. Now, this was a colossal piece of work. It took around about 30 years to complete, and the original plan was that they would get rid of Nobby's entirely, but there was such a local fuss about it, such a furor, that in the end they only reduced it from 62 metres to 28 metres, which is still quite a lot, I know, but this is the first recorded example of community activism in Australia. Hooray!
So, having saved a lump of rock called Nobby's Head, the locals ended up with a beach which they called Nobby's Beach. I put it on my walk for two reasons. One, it gives me another chance to say Nobby's on the telly. And two, because of a very unusual visitor.
Around here, the weather can change just like that, and it certainly did on June the 7th, 2007. There were 56 ships moored out here, all waiting to load up with coal. And as the weather started to get really bad, the Port of Newcastle Corporation radioed them and said, back off, there's a storm coming. And most of them did, but one that didn't was a big ship, massive, 77,000 tonnes. It was called the Pasha Bulker.
By next morning, conditions had become horrific. With no ballast in its holds and its propeller half out of the water, it was an accident waiting to happen. And did it happen? The Pasha Bulker was pushed up the coast and then, bang! It stuck right there about 30 metres off Nobby's Beach. Now, this could be a major ecological disaster with oil slicks all over the beaches and thousands of seabirds covered with oil. The whole of Australia was focused on this beach on that day. Nobby's Beach Surf Club became the nerve centre for the rescue operation.
Henry, did you get one in for me?
Hey, that's for you, Tony. How are you, mate?
Cheers, mate.
Hey, same.
Warren, were you on duty as a lifeguard that day?
Yes, I was, mate. We were here just watching, basically, for the first part of it all before the real drama really started.
But then you went in yourself, didn't you?
Myself and our lifeguards got their jet skis together and came out 3 of our local surfers that surf the big waves.
On your jet skis?
On the jet skis, yeah. They went on for 2.5 hours, and that was some of the most scariest moments, not only for us and our skis, but what we watched those, the Westpac rescue helicopter do, was just unbelievable.
And no one was killed?
No one was killed. Everyone returned to shore safely, and they were very heroic, their job, what they did that day.
Henry, apart from the issue of the crew, there were about 700 tonnes of fuel on board, weren't there?
I'm not sure if they pumped it off or crated it off or how, but they got almost all that fuel off and left us with a very pristine beach.
But once the original danger had been averted, it seems to me that the people of Newcastle quite enjoyed this moment of drama.
It was the greatest tourism attraction we've had for years and years, and that lasted for quite a while. You have a look at that beer coaster there. One of our members decided that we could make a few dollars out of those. Made a lot of money for the surf club. Was very, very good for us, yeah.
Do you reckon I could pinch this one?
Yeah, if you're very quick, you could pinch that one, yes.
Good to meet you both. Thanks for your bravery, mate. Even though this moment of high drama only happened a few years ago, it's already starting to fade from the memory of most Australians, except that here, on the headland, above the beach, there's a piece of the Pasha Balka which has been set into the concrete as a reminder of that terrible day. And it's not this great red curve here, that's just a piece of art. It's this manky, rusty plate from the hull. Bloody ship.
"210 years before the Pasha Balka Gate crashed Newcastle, another unplanned boat arrival kick-started this place. On board was one Lieutenant John Shortland, who'd been sent from Sydney to chase escaped convicts. Unsuccessfully, as it happened.
He waded ashore, scrabbled around for a bit, then bent down and picked something up. You know what it was, don't you? A lump of coal. He immediately realised that this was a really significant moment in the history of the colony, and he wrote to his dad that it more than made up for losing the convicts.
Pretty soon, Newcastle's first mine, just here behind the breakwater, was churning the stuff out. And in less than 2 years, Newcastle was sending it around the world. The city's love affair with coal had begun.
Here's something you don't see every day, a statue to a piece of coal. It's not exactly Michelangelo, is it? But what it does tell us is that by the middle of the 19th century, Newcastle had vast stocks of coal, and the people around here were paranoid that someone might try and nick it. They even thought that the Russians, thousands of miles away in northern Europe, might sail across and grab it. It was total tosh, of course, but nevertheless, Newcastle decided it needed some robust defences.
So they built the terrifyingly named Fort Scratchley.
Andrew, come on. You do realise I'm destroying the whole premise of this series, which is supposed to be that I'm doing walks, not hitching lifts, but it is a Jeep, isn't it?
Oh, it is, mate.
Come on, Andrew. Andrew, given that the Russian threat wasn't real, why did they build this fort?
Well, I think they were a bit worried that the British were leaving Australia, and I think Newcastle wanted to stand on its own and say we're as good as Sydney and we could have our own military presence up here.
But after all the investment that was put into this place, the Russians never turned up, did they?
They certainly didn't.
But somebody else did.
Yes, they did. The Japanese came in here in 1942.
And what defended you against the Japanese?
These 2 Mark 7 6-inch guns.
So who actually fired the gun?
Captain Wal Watson was a battery commander at the time, and he'd been stood to all night while the attack on Sydney was going on. He just got to bed and the alarm went off that Newcastle was under attack. So he thought it was a false alarm. He ran up to the observation post to take charge, still in his pyjamas, suddenly realised we were under attack, gave the order to fire, And then command come through and said, "You've got permission to fire." And he said, "Well, tell him I bloody well have." So he did give the orders to fire in his pyjamas.
He's probably the only person in the whole of the Second World War.
I'd say he probably was.
And we are going to lovingly recreate that moment now with the help of the local historical society. Can I join in this, lads?
You may.
Thank you very much.
Number 2 gun, load! Make safe. Number 2 gun, fire!
I have just fired one of the only 2 working 6-inch Mark 7 guns in the entire world. Who says the British Empire's dead? Thank you, guys. Thanks for your help. See ya. I'm just coming back down from the fort, heading towards town, but before I do that, I just want to show you this over here. You've no idea what you're looking at, have you? See where all those cars are parked? That is actually part of San Francisco, which I better explain, hadn't I? That's all reclaimed land, and it was reclaimed with ballast from the ships which came from San Francisco, and they dumped the ballast there before they picked up the coal. Why was there so much ballast in San Francisco? Well, it was all from the 1906 San Francisco earthquake. So that is really a little piece of Haight-Ashbury. Love and peace. Right, let's head on. Some of us never really left the 60s.
In early times, this area, East Newcastle, was home to the oarsmen who manned the port's pilot boats and lifeboats. So I wouldn't have lived here because, as a rower, I make a great pedestrian. Times changed, the pilots slowly moved out, and this became the city's red light district. Also no good to me, because as a prostitute, I make a great rower, if you see where I'm going. In recent times, the place has become, dare I say, trendy. So why the ups and downs?
Fish and chips, please. Sure. Thanks. In 1915, BHP, which was and is one of the biggest companies in the whole of Australia, set up a steelworks here. Overnight, Newcastle was transformed from coal town to steel city. Thousands of jobs were created. The money rolled in. But then, at the end of the 20th century, BHP pulled out again. Thanks a lot. Oh, so good.
So it's 1999 and 10,000 steel jobs are gone. But that wasn't all. Slowly, the ever-present dust and smog of industrial life lifted. It revealed a city of lovely old colonial and Victorian buildings. Not to mention some cracking beaches. Novocastrians have always been a pretty positive breed, and now there was a renewed sense of optimism. As one wag put it, BHP did 2 great things for Newcastle. It came and it went. Hear, hear. And now I'm off to Bolton Street in the centre of town.
This is exactly the kind of place that you need to explore if you're on a walk through history and you're looking for some rare historical jewels. I know this is just a rather ugly 60s or 70s car park, but look over here. Isn't that pretty? It's called Rose Cottage, and it's the oldest house in the whole of Newcastle, built around about 1828. It's great that it's been preserved and rather beautifully done, I think, but you'd hardly call it accessible, would you? Nevertheless, let's get inside. I don't think there's anybody there. In its early days, it was owned by a bloke called Black Harris, who used to Shanghai sailors. He'd drug them or get them drunk, and they'd wake up on board ship and have to work their passage. He was a terrible villain. But now it's owned by a firm of lawyers.
Who I'm sure are very learned people. One thing I've learnt about Newcastle, it's full of surprises. Whether you're at the beach, going to war, or walking through a car park. What next? Well, the second half of our walk starts right here on King Street.
It's a bit weird, isn't it, when you're walking through a city and suddenly you start climbing up a steep grassy knoll like something out of Jack and Jill Went Up the Hill. But actually, beneath my feet is the possibility of some magnificent archaeology, because this is the site of one of the oldest cemeteries in the whole of Australia. 3,300 bodies stretching back to the year 1802.
Sadly, there's no sign of them now, thanks to a typically insensitive 60s redevelopment, when the gravestones were ripped out to create a rest park. I reckon the only things resting here are dead shopping trolleys and bloodthirsty mozzies.
But all isn't lost. The council have managed to identify where a lot of those gravestones were originally sited, and as you can see, they're starting to put a lot of them back. And you see that view of the sea over there? Well, you can't see it here or here or here or here, can you? So they're going to cut down as many of those trees as is possible, and hopefully they'll be able to create a fantastic new vantage site from which the people here can have a look at their city. But what really tickles me about this story is this. You remember I said in the 1960s, all of the graves were completely wiped away, completely destroyed. Well, that's true, except for one. This glorious thing. Who did it belong to? The first mayor of Newcastle and his wife.
I wonder what old James Hunnell would think of the city now, with its modern quayside developments and trendy cafes. Would he sit me down to share a fashionably small latte? Or encourage me to harangue passers-by about their local history? Let me see.
Ladies and gentlemen, did you know that the first Australian dictionary was written in Newcastle? Did you know that?
No.
Oh, it's absolutely true. You can see how impressed our friends here are by that knowledge. It was in the year 1812. Anyone got any idea what a strumpet is or was?
A lady of ill repute.
A lady of ill repute. Congratulations. How on earth do you know that? This is a bit more difficult. What are barking irons?
Guns.
Guns, yes, pair of guns. Bang, bang, bang. Well done. It's a bit scary that you know the answer to that. What is to frisk the Cly? Frisk the Cly. Here's a clue. To frisk the Cly. Sorry, just keep talking.
Pickpocket?
Yes, that is to pickpocket. To beef a man. Sounds fairly horrendous, doesn't it? What does to beef a man mean?
Beat him up.
No, it's the opposite, actually. It means to stop a thief. Now, the bloke who wrote this James Hardy Vaux, he was actually a convict himself. In fact, he's the only bloke that we could find who was transported to Australia on 3 separate occasions. He was such a bad bloke. But he kind of worked with the authorities at the same time. So he drafted this book, which he called The Vocabulary of the Flash Language, which, quite frankly, I think you guys ought to learn. You've shown such a basic ignorance of it, because you laugh, but if you ever get busted, you won't be able to understand what the other convicts are saying, will you? If they tell you they want you to beef a man, you're going to be in trouble. Bye. When I was 17, I used to work for a firm of ship's victuallers. I'd got this little Austin 7 van, and I'd drive down to the Port of London, open the back doors, and then I'd walk down a gangplank like this one, carrying great sides of meat and cans of baked beans and tomatoes, and I would give them, and this is the really eerie coincidence, to the cooks on board the coal boats from Newcastle on Tyne who just come down to London. Well, they used to do exactly that kind of job of ship's victualling in this Newcastle in the 19th century, although it was much more hectic than I was used to. They didn't have Austin 7 vans, did they? They were called butcher boats?
That's right, they had these things called butcher boats. You can see the one here, they're about 9 metres long, pointy at both ends, very fast, and they used to row out and tout their wares to the boats as they arrived.
How far away were the ships?
Well, as far as 50 miles. They used to go 50 miles down the coast. They're out for 20 hours sometimes. They'd leave at 3 a.m. in the morning. And
why didn't they wait until the ships arrived in port?
Well, it was a competitive thing. There'd be big races, and once they got to the boat, they'd be climbing up on the sides and they'd be pulling each other down, and the first one up, they usually got the deal.
And this is actually one of them?
It is a beautiful exhibit.
Shall we have a look?
Yeah.
Because you've all been paying attention, you'll remember what I said earlier about me and rowing. So rather than make a total wally of myself, I thought you'd like to watch the lads from Nobby's Beach Surf Club put a butcher boat through its paces.
Put your backs into it, guys. It's a meat contract we had out there. Smile, you're on the telly. The guys who rowed on the butcher's boats racing competitions?
Yeah, definitely. They were professional rowers. In fact, Australia dominated the rowing from the 1870s through the early 1900s, mostly through professional rowers like this.
Oh, that was slightly more difficult than driving an Austin 7, wasn't it?
Just a little bit.
Yeah. Thanks a lot for that, it was brilliant.
Thank you, Tony. Thanks
Cheers.
for coming.
I've done a bit of research which suggests that Newcastle and alcohol have a, well, colourful history. In the early days, one commanding officer was actually given the old heave-ho when his soldiers dobbed him in for drinking their grog. What a cheek.
But the most famous incident of that ilk took place right here in this very alleyway and in this very building. Used to be known as the Star Hotel. It was owned by Tooth's Brewery, and they just took the rent. They didn't take the profit, so quite frankly, it didn't really matter to them whether the place was successful or not. And eventually Tooth said they'd demolish it, and local people were up in arms. On the fateful night of September the 19th, 1979, the final gig took place, the coppers moved in, and all hell broke out. Pete, this must have been a crazy place in those days.
The craziest. So much so that the craziness still lives on 30 years down the track.
And you were there on that celebrated night and were quite central to the events.
Yeah, I was the guitar player and singer in the band called The Heroes, and we were the last band to play at the Star Hotel.
When was the last time you were here?
September 19th, 1979.
So you haven't been here since?
Nope. Driven past it 1,000 times, but never been here since.
Do you want to come in and have another look?
Love to.
Does it look like you remember it?
It smells as crappy as it did then.
It was supposed to be a house of ill repute at one time.
Yeah, well, it always had an ill repute, so that's in keeping with its history, I think.
What do you remember about the night?
I remember that it was a great gig. That's probably the first thing I remember.
Do you remember what you were playing when the police arrived?
Oh, most definitely. It was a song called The Star and the Slaughter. It was an original song written by the band.
So it was written about the pub?
That's what everyone said, but no, it wasn't, in fact.
What kind of lyrics did it have?
The chorus went, well, I want action, I want fighting in the streets. We're going to take this town by storm, we're going to burn the village down. You know, so after the riot, the coppers were going through the lyrics of the song going, yep, that happened, that. They must have written that in the band room in the break.
You will probably remember this noise. This is a recording of what happened at the time.
He's just been hit on the head by a rather large rock. He's probably seriously hurt. In fact, if he's not seriously hurt, he's very badly injured. They had tipped over a police car. I've never seen anything like this in Australia. It's just the most extraordinary situation.
So you were trapped inside here while this noise was going on out there?
Yeah, there were so many people there that you just simply couldn't get out into the street. But then we could hear this noise going on outside, and it was a roar by this stage. And people were coming and saying, man, it's all going down outside. So we forced our way through the crowd and stepped out into King Street. It just took a moment to recognise what was going on. I saw petrol that was running down the street into the gutter across the road. And the exact thought I had was, if somebody lights that, we're in deep shit. And seconds later, and the flame ran down the street, and there was a paddy wagon parked on the side of the street. That went up as well. And there was a very brave policeman who, only a young guy, and he thought somebody was in the paddy wagon. And he raced out of nowhere and unlocked the paddy wagon to see if anybody was inside. Luckily, there wasn't.
Why do you think the riot kicked off?
The riot took place because there was too much alcohol and too many drugs. Then the Colosseum effect took over, and the punters just wanted blood.
Did it destroy your career?
Oh, far from it. Ultimately, it gave us a certain amount of notoriety, and we went on to do an album and a couple of singles, and we supported AC/DC on their tour of Australia in 1981. So my 15 minutes has lasted a fair while, Tony, I've got to tell you, you know.
One night, 30 years ago, this whole alleyway was seething with alcohol and anger and drugs and inept policing. And now it's all quiet and it's just a bit of an old dump, really.
You've got to love a historical walk that starts at the beach and ends at the pub. Very Newcastle, that.
A sense of local identity seems to me to be really important round here. Everyone still reads the local paper and watches the local TV news. And while I've been on my walk, so many people have stopped me to tell me something about the history of the place, always with pride in their voices. Newcastle has changed an awful lot over the years, and since the closure of the steelworks in 1999, it's had to change even faster. And I bet you, if I come back here in 10 years' time on another walk, there'll be 100 more stories for me to tell about this gutsy, gritty town. That bloke looks a bit miserable, doesn't he? I'm not surprised. He's been under that shower for over 130 years. This is Carlton Gardens, where the people of Melbourne have their wine shows and food shows and auto shows and expos and sexpos. Now, you may see a magnificent piece of corporate landscaping, but what I see is a huge pile of foul, stinking dung. You coming or what?
Walking through the Melbourne suburb of Carlton. It's one of the city's most diverse pockets, which could explain some trigger-happy trade unionists,
blam, 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 blam,
a 19th century scientific scandal,
basically a slimy bottom dweller,
and a very naughty street protest.
We may well be busted.
No.
Oh, you troublemaker.
But first, let's talk dung.
In the early days of Melbourne, what's now Carlton Gardens was a wilderness where the townspeople could go for a ramble with lots of tall grass and native trees and marsupials hopping about. But as it grew because of the gold rush, they started to have a waste problem. What to do with the damn stuff? So a pile of poo landed up here, and then another one over here, and then another one, and another one, until the whole place was one fetid mass. In fact, a local journalist said that if you wanted to enjoy the fountain, then you had to walk through circles of smell that were so foul, it was like the darkness that descended on Egypt in biblical times. It's probably worth the walk, though. If the fountain was anything like that one, it would have been quite a treat, wouldn't it? You see all those cute little platypuses there?
Our first stop today is that grand old lady right behind the fountain. In the golden age of international exhibitions in the 19th century, the exhibition building was Melbourne's way of saying to the rest of the world, oh, look at me, look at me. And to this day, people still do.
Although, to be honest, if you want to explore a place like this, don't go in the swanky doors. Sneak round, come here, sneak round somewhere like this.
The bowels of the building are home to Melbourne Museum's paleontology collection. I could look at some old bones and fossils, but I prefer to dig up some scientific dirt.
Rob, 150 years ago, this was a sea of spite, wasn't it?
It certainly was. There was a huge fight going on between two characters, Wilhelm Blandowski, the government zoologist, and Frederick McCoy, who was already director of the museum.
Blandowski, an ambitious Darwinist, coveted McCoy's job. But McCoy, a committed creationist, had powerful allies within the Royal Society. So Blandowski resorted to scientific name-calling.
So how do these fish fit into the story?
Well, Blandowski went to the River Murray-Darling and he identified, amongst other things, 19 fish, and he named them after members of the Royal Society. And they were impressed with that. They weren't too happy when they started to read the descriptions of the fish, however.
What kind of descriptions were they?
Well, this one here, who he named after the current president, Bleasdale, he described it as living in the mud at the bottom of the river, and that was interpreted as describing the president as basically a slimy bottom dweller.
The Mayor of Melbourne, Richard Eads, also copped a serve. His namesake fish was low-browed, big-gutted and spiny. But when Blandowski published his scientific paper, the Royal Society had the last laugh.
This volume here shows what the council decided to do.
This note here, page 131 to 134 inclusive, with 4 plates, are omitted from this volume of the transactions by an order of the council. They censored his work.
They censored his work. This was scientific censorship, and this was to avoid their embarrassment at the descriptions of the fish.
Blandowski's career was effectively finished, all thanks to a couple of ugly fish.
What I really find sad is that though McCoy had this glittering career, Blandowski ended up dying insane in a mental institution. Still, on.
Dung-filled parks, bowels of buildings and slimy bottom dwellers. I think it's time to raise the tone of this walk. Considering it's perched right on the edge of the business district, Carlton has oodles of old-world charm.
This is Drummond Street, which is pretty typical of Carlton streets in many ways, although in some ways it isn't. Look at all this lovely green sward and the big trees and the width of the street. Well, there is a reason for that. At this house, 135, lived a bloke called Patrick Costello, who was a member of the Legislative Assembly, a pretty corrupt one, and at an apparently convivial and boozy meeting of the council, he managed to persuade the councillors to widen and beautify his street. And if you're wondering about the surname of that dodgy politician, Costello, he was actually the great-great-grandfather of the Federal Treasurer in the Howard years, Peter Costello, who, of course, wasn't a dodgy politician.
Fortunately, the Pollies, dodgy or otherwise, have made sure that much of Carlton's 19th century charm hasn't been lost. Which is a good thing. Mostly.
Pretty little terrace there, pretty terrace there, pretty terrace there. Vulgar lump of huge monstrosity there. It is quite disgusting, isn't it? It's called Benvenuta, and it was built by a family of gunmakers and arms dealers who made their fortune selling their weapons on the goldfields. It's got to be, what, 15 tons of marble and all these little curly bits. I don't want to be a snob, but it's new money, isn't it? No taste, no style.
Unlike your modern-day arms dealers. By the way, you know that Melbourne saying about 4 seasons in one day? Well, it's true.
I was going to go straight up there to Lygon Street for coffee and creamy cakes, but I noticed that, which, if you don't know, is the 8-hour memorial, because Melbourne was the first place in the world to achieve an 8-hour day for its working people. 8 hours work, 8 hours leisure and 8 hours rest. As you can see, the fight is still going on. This building is the Trades Hall, and this is the kind of Carlton history that really interests me, I have to say. I think we might as well go into the Trades Hall. I don't even know if we got permission to do this, but what are they going to do? Throw us out at worst, and at least I can get dry and the camera can dry off too. This is a far cry from all the elaborate scroll work of Benvenuto, isn't it? Look at this, all the names of the people who were involved in trying to get better rights for working people. All their names recorded in this beautiful golden scroll work. You can imagine them all pacing up and down in their cloth caps, their dark coats, their lots and lots of facial hair, of course. And yes, when you get to the big stairway, this is a tribute to the pioneers of the 8-hour day. See how many of them were masons? James Dalgetty, Jephthah Freeman. There were so many masons involved in that particular struggle.
They were turbulent times for these working-class warriors. Fighting for political and social equality, we take for granted. But some union battles weren't quite so noble.
In the year 1916, there was a big row about whether or not a ballot was being conducted appropriately or inappropriately, and the firearms went off, excuse me, guys, blam, 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 they were going, people ducking, and the bullet holes buried themselves apparently into the walls. That could be one, couldn't it? Just there, can you see that? I mean, that might just be a hole where someone pinned up a poster, but we're going to say it's a bullet hole. Blam, blam, blam.
Unfortunately, it's still raining, but I'm afraid I can't resist the siren song of Lygon Street any longer.
There you are. This is interesting. That contraption there was the very first modern espresso machine ever imported into Australia. So that was the beginning of all that.
And all this was the start of a cafe culture that spread right across Australia.
In a way, Lygon Street is like a snapshot from history, because it was originally created long ago by Italians when they were servicing a really vibrant immigrant community, which has gone long ago. Now the customers who come here are the middle classes from the city, and this is like a cosmopolitan catering Disneyland. Does that sound a bit sniffy? It's not really meant to be. I'd eat here every night if I could.
Not that my waistline or my wife would let me. Anyway, let's move on.
I always think that when you're walking through a town, you want to keep looking up, because that's where the gold nuggets are, and that is the perfect example. Beautiful old neon sign, Bassari's Corner, that's Nino Bassari. You're a Nino Bassari, aren't you? But that was your dad.
That was my father, exactly.
What's the story behind that sign?
Well, it's a fascinating story. Dad was an Olympic gold medalist won a gold medal in the 1932 Olympics for Italy, not Australia. And he was contracted to come out in 1938 by the Victorian government for the centenary bike race. And when the war broke out, he was stuck here. He'd been given a key to the city. They couldn't intern him, but they couldn't let him go. Stuck as a professional cyclist, he only had one thing he could do. He could ride bikes and repair them. Some of his fans loaned him some money, and he started up Bassari's.
This is quite extraordinary, isn't it? That there was your dad, an enemy in an alien country, and they let him set up a shop and he didn't have a problem.
Yeah, well, to his great pride, and I think to all Australians, not a single rock was ever thrown through his window during the war, even though it was operated by an enemy alien technically at that time.
From enemy alien, it was a short trip to unofficial royalty. After the war, Nino Bassari's popularity earned him the title of the King of Carlton.
This is the present-day Bassari bike shop. As you can see, the bikes here are a far cry from the ones that Nino would have been selling in the 1950s. This is the perfect example. It's made of aluminium and wood. It was imported from Italy just after the war. And I was planning to ride off on it, but quite frankly, this saddle is disappearing so far up my bum that I think I'm just going to leave it there and walk off.
So when I said Carlton, I bet you didn't think slanderous fish, kitsch arms dealers and alien cyclists. Come to think of it, why would you? Anyway, the sun's out again and I'm going shopping where the locals hang out.
Could I have that plate of prosciutto as well? So much gorgeous stuff here. Thanks. A lot of the Italian food has been in the Australian culture for a long time. I thought that most Italians had arrived here around about the time of the Second World War, like the guys in the bike shop. But in fact, there have been Italians in Carlton for much longer.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Some people have been shopping here for quite a long time. Gloria, how old do you reckon you were when you first came into this shop?
I'd say approximately 5.
And how old are you now?
89.
Congratulations. How long have your family been in this country?
I'd say approximately since 1890. They came over poverty-stricken, but at heart they were musicians.
Long before buskers needed licences, Gloria's forebears proudly plied their trade on the streets of Carlton, playing the Vigenese folk songs of their southern Italian home. Music that can still be heard today.
This is Dorrit Street, where a lot of Gloria's childhood memories took place. And you hear that? Does that remind you of when you were a little girl?
It certainly does.
This is music of the old country, isn't it?
My word.
Close your eyes and listen to that. I can almost imagine myself back there with Gloria and her family, sharing a rough red, some local produce, and listening to the folk music her great-grandparents listened to. It's a trip to another time and another culture. Carlton will do that to you.
There's another story about this house which involves completely different people in very dark circumstances.
It's 1949. This woman, a prostitute called Jean Lee, and her 2 accomplices try to rob a drunk bookmaker when things go horribly wrong.
Jean was on the sofa with the bloke and she was trying to get the money out of his pocket and couldn't because he was so fat, and the blokes burst in and there was some kind of argument and they started bashing him, and then the fight turned into systematic torture and Jean glassed the bloke in the face and he eventually died.
Jean and her accomplices were caught, convicted and then hanged in 1951. But the times were a-changing in Australia.
People started thinking, by hanging a woman, are we doing something which really doesn't reflect very well on the psyche of Australia? And in fact, she became the last woman ever to be executed in Australia. So even though it's a horrible story right in this room, something quite good came out of it. Bravo!
Thank you, Tony, for having me.
Truly glorious.
Thank you. Thanks for the Italian kiss.
Bye, guys.
See ya. Bye.
With my savage breast suitably soothed, it's time to fire it up again. I'm off to nearby Faraday Street for some alternative theatre, 60s style.
Oh, the glitter of showbiz is so alluring, isn't it? 42nd Street, Shaftesbury Avenue, Sydney Opera House. This little alleyway might not be quite so romantic, but it does lead to a Carlton icon, one of the most influential and indeed one of the smallest theatres in Australia, La Mama. That light doesn't seem to be on, so let's have a look. It's such a tiny theatrical space, look. There's only I think it's 35 seats. Not the most cost-effective form of theatre, but fantastic performance space.
2 words describe La Mama's style: garde and avant. Not necessarily in that order. These actors are improvising on the theme of melancholy, but their 1969 counterparts preferred a very public challenge to Australia's legal and social landscape.
One of the great things about such a tiny theatre is that every available bit of space needs to be used. So even this courtyard, it's not just where the bar and the catering take place, but it's a theatrical space too. Bill, there's one legendary day, isn't there, in the history of La Mama, that the events took place right here, and it wasn't just a play, but it was a real theatrical event.
It was using theatre to tackle the censorship situation in Australia head-on at that time. You've got to understand that in the late 60s, censorship was so tight in Australia that when you came into the country, customs searched your bags not for drugs but for books. And just a few months before the events that took place here, Graham Blundell, who was a director here in the theatre, his house was raided at 6 o'clock in the morning by the Vice Squad, whose job it was to check on theatrical performances and so on. And his bookcases were searched for filthy drama scripts and so on. So John Romerell, a playwright, decided we should take on the authorities in public. And so he wrote a play called Whatever Happened to Realism, and it was staged here.
It was a racy little piece which climaxed with actors shouting obscenities being arrested by other actors playing Vice Squad cops.
Just as they were doing that, the real Vice Squad detectives also rose up, out of the audience, followed them up and arrested everybody.
So they may just have been coppers, but they had an impeccable sense of timing.
They did, yes.
And what happened next?
Well, you see, they had to do something with them, having arrested them, so they decided to take them to the local police station.
We have at least a dozen actors in there. I'll see if I can get them to recreate that day. Fingers crossed. Hello? Right, we've got our volunteers. Out you come, everyone. And it was here that the actual performance took place.
That's right, the stage was here. The audience was right along the car park here, back into the street, about 150 people.
150? Yeah, because you'd only have got 35 in
that's
there,
right,
wouldn't you?
yeah.
So did they deliberately have the performance out here?
Absolutely. It was necessary for the obscenities to be uttered in a public place where you were committing an offence.
And what were the obscenities?
Bugger off, will you?
Did you get that? Yeah. All right, let's rehearse that. 1, 2, 3, and.
Bugger off, will ya?
One more.
Bugger off, will ya?
OK, that's brilliant. OK, so we'll be the actors, all right, Bill?
Okay.
And you are the irate audience as we're being dragged off.
Yeah.
We're being dragged off to the police station, and you.
Bugger off, will ya? 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 Bugger off, will ya?
So what were the lines from the play the irate audience was shouting? I'll tell you. Probably not John Romerill's finest work, but it was certainly pithy. Eventually, everyone arrived at the local police station, and the actors were taken in to be charged.
Thank you very much. That was very impressive. Take 5. Take 5. Oh, you troublemaker. This is actually the police station that the demonstration arrived at.
That's it, that's the place. And inside the police sergeant is saying, bring some squad cars in, but don't use sirens. We're surrounded by an audience here.
We're surrounded by an audience. What hell that must have been for them. And what happened?
Well, they were charged, and across the road they were put on trial before the magistrate.
In that courthouse?
In that courthouse right there. And the first case was dismissed, and the rest of them, then nothing happened, and so that was it.
So was it really a storm in a teacup?
No, not at all. It was the beginning of the end for that sort of censorship of the theatre in Australia, together with actions that were taking place in other theatres around the country. This was the end of the Vice Squad sitting in the theatre waiting to be offended.
But the double irony is that a law has just been reenacted in Victoria, hasn't it, which says you're not allowed to swear in the street. So actually what we've been doing has been as illegal as what they were doing all those years ago.
That's right.
So if we just stay here, we may well be busted.
If there are still any police around.
Seems like we're okay. Phew, that was a close call. Bye.
So that's Carlton. Socially, culturally and politically, I think we've covered a lot of ground, don't you? But it's been one of our shortest walks, so if you don't mind, I might squeeze in one more stop.
It's a secret. No signs on the door, nothing. What could it be? Hey up, gentlemen. Is this table private, or can anyone join in?
Join us.
Thank you.
It's a word-of-mouth private restaurant, a popular haunt for long-time Carltonites, like John Timlin, Max Gillies and John Romerill. Yes, that playwright.
Do you think that in those days living in Carlton gave you quite an identity?
Oh, yeah. People would say, where do you live? If you went to Sydney, I'd say, you wouldn't say Melbourne, you'd say I live in Carlton. Mm-hmm. So it had a certain cachet, and I think that was probably connected both with the universities and the theatre.
OK, I know where Carlton's been, but where's it going to go?
So where do you think Carlton might be heading in the next 10 to 20 years?
I think it'll be business as usual. There's a fabulous mix of people. A lot of artists live here. Intelligentsia sort of industries, design, all that stuff. It's got great virtues.
Yeah, exactly. It's still a very culturally vibrant place. You know, I think this would continue to be a place for creative, stimulating, intellectual, social life as a matter of course.
Something tells me if I don't get out now, I never will.
I've really enjoyed the Carlton that I've seen on my walk, and I'm really pleased that the flag bearers of the old Carlton aren't turning their noses up at the present day one, but think that with a fair wind it'll continue to grow and prosper as a multicultural, slightly alternative place. And having said that, you'd now expect me at the end of the programme probably to walk off towards the horizon looking thoughtful and slightly inspired. But I'm not going to. I'm going to go back in there, have another drink with the lads.